Oh, wait.
Was I have the Zoom link?
Okay. When I go through it, it's okay. I don't need to know. You do. The notes are not sure.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. If you're in my class, 340, make sure you grab a chunk comprehension check, ask questions at the end. But welcome. I'm glad to have you all here. We're excited to welcome Bengisu here as well. Bengisu Hachitay is a PhD candidate in the Computer Sciences Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the People and Robotics Laboratory. And so through qualitative and design-based research, she explores how social robots can be used in family life and facilitate family routines. And so she received her PhD minor in human ecology and family studies, a master's degree in cognitive sciences from Middle East Technical University, and VS degree in computer science from Bilkent University. And so her prior work has been published and recognized in HCI venues, so human computer interaction venues, including ACM-CHI, IDC, and HRI conferences. And her work is supported by funding from the National Science Foundation. And so please join me in welcoming Sue. Excited for us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alyssa. Like Alyssa mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate. That means that I'm soon to be a doctor, if that doesn't mean anything for you. But so I'm part of the People and Robots Laboratory from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'm gonna walk you through my PhD research journey and kind of try to explain what type of work I've done related to designing robots for everyday family life. Yes, okay. So I want to set a vision of what within my work, how I think of what robots in everyday life might look like. But before I do that, I want to get a sense of the room. Has anyone heard of social robots? Do you know of any products? Can I see a set of hands, even if you have heard of? I think so, not many people. If you might throw some names of what you've heard of so I can...
Pepper?
Pepper, yes, that's one. Actually, that's the robot on the screen. I see. Anyone else? Asimo? Yeah, that would count. And anything else that you know of? Okay, that's good to know. I have some examples for you later on. But so in my research, when I think about social robots in everyday life, let me first define what social robots are, given that these robots are specific technologies that are designed to interact with us, with people, in a socially engaging way. So it can be, so usually they model human-like behaviors, let's say like gaze, contact, nonverbal gestures, some mobility. Some of them come in like these, are designed like these humanoid forms. Some of them come in different animal-like forms. But in general, they are designed to interact with us instead of work and do stuff for us. And within this vision of, you might be asking yourself, like now that robotics and AI is growing really fast. We see a lot of tech companies in the Bay Area that are trying to design robots like these. But what might it really mean to live with a social robot? And that's kind of how I look at, that's what I look at in my research. And in this example, we can imagine that this robot, Pepper, is, let's say it's designed for helping children practice their theater lines. And then let's say Sarah is here at home. she's practicing her lines because, let's say, her parents are normally not available. And maybe they might not have bought this robot, but they might have lent it from a service, it might be something like that, or you might actually own this robot like a personal computer in your home. So even though this might be designed for a child and robot interaction, what I'm also interested in is these moments of when a child is interacting with a robot, what is happening in the surroundings. So in this example, we see that the parents seem engaged, siblings seem engaged. Maybe they're practicing, she's practicing her theater play to her family. So basically, this is the vision that I'm trying to, I guess, steer my research forward to. And I've been really lucky enough to have been able to conduct many studies in the real world. And this is, you can see some children and their parents interacting with the social robot. And I observe these settings starting from the very first moment that children unbox these robots to the very end moment that they say goodbye to it. You can see that there are kids were dancing, they're doing like a yoga activity facilitated by the robot. And what we do know from current research is that social robots particularly, can promote value in family life. This can be ranging from learning, can be social engagement, excitement, creativity, and applications like that. But what I am specifically interested in is how can robots facilitate connection making between different family members within the home. So given that, in my research, I focus on this aspect of how can we understand the expectations of family members and their real use patterns, which then in turn reveals us that this family-centered approach is important when we're designing and integrating these robots into everyday life. So that's kind of the main statement I'm going to try to convince you throughout today, that we really need to look at the family level for us to understand how robots will be making their place in everyday life. So I asked you a couple examples of what type of robots you might know, but we don't really see them in everyday life, and you might think of them, oh, are they just research products, research platforms? Well, actually not. They are commercially available robots available, and that's how I want to frame my research at the beginning. So some examples are, actually Amazon has a Astra robot. Technically, it's available to purchase on Amazon. It just needs a special invitation for early adopters. Here's another example of a Moxie robot. This is a robot specifically designed to help nurses and doctors within hospital settings. It's both social, but it also has some utility functions where it can like open, it can even like an elevator, it can get on an elevator, open doors, pick up supplies, or nurses can put supplies in its drawers and then send it off to a different floor and etc. Another example, actually, this one I saw it. There's a coffee shop down in South San Jose that has this barista robot. And then maybe you might have seen some of these food delivery robots on certain campuses. And these are all like utility-driven robots that are still designed to interact with people, let's say through, greeting or having small, conversations as they're doing their product work. This is another example. It's technically not a commercially available robot, but it's developed by the Honda Research Institute in Japan. I kind of wanted to show it just because you can see the range of like different emotional expressions that they have designed for this robot. And I think, yes, so with that, I think that kind of sets the foundation of what type of robots are available out there. But I do argue, I mean, you probably agree with me that social robots are novel products in everyday life, even more so in family life. So again, the question is what is in the way of these robots becoming daily products within everyday life, I argue that it's not just a technical challenge where it's not that so we've seen products that are available, but there is this other social challenge that really is a barrier for these products to be integrated into the real world. And I'll walk you through a couple of the more technical challenges. In our field, we call this this the aspect of designing an interaction between a technology and a human. The field is called the interaction design, and specifically in human-robot interaction design, some challenges are that it's really hard to build robots that people want to interact with over a long period of time that might last over a couple, weeks, months, or years. It's really hard to put these robots into real-world settings where they would work reliably. And then also another big challenge is how can these technologies interact with groups of users that have different values and needs and priorities. So that was the interaction design. So it's like what the robot would do in those settings. But when we look, so let's assume we have a well-designed interactive robot. The next challenge is this integration challenge, where if we were going to put these into the real world, homes, for example, or the public spaces, they're physically complex areas, and they're always, maybe you might not be able to see this, but this is like from a photo from a home that we did the deployment. It's just always changing. There's this, the parents are coming in, children are coming in and out. And then it's also an intergenerational setting within the home. There are a lot of people with different needs, like children, grandparents, and parents. So it's a challenge to integrate within these certain contexts. And like that's not, even if that's not enough, I think we also have this extra layer of media representations of social robots, particularly it's mostly portrayed in this polarized way where they're either super social, really, approachable, doing these superhuman things, or they're at the other end of the spectrum where they're these really violent, scary, destructive robots. You might know about the Megan robot. It was the movie that came out. Number 2 is coming out soon. But yeah, so like these types of media portrayals, we know through research, they impact how people perceive the robots. And unfortunately, these unrealistic perceptions lead to the product failures that when we look at it from a product standpoint. So people either are skeptical of purchasing these robots, or they are skeptical of, like, say, sustaining it over long term. So I have a couple examples for you. These 3 robots were actually already, so this is Enki, Jibo, and Kuri. I believe Kuri was a Silicon Valley startup company as well. They all failed even before I started my PhD. So before, and this article, I can't see it, but it was written in 2019, kind of talking about what can we learn from these robotic failures. And then we have this robot, Moxie, that was released in like 2023. And it was very promising, and I kind of want to dive into that a little bit. But I think the general challenge that I want to point out is that, yes, these products fail because of the challenge of both designing these sustained user interactions and real-world integration. But I'm going to dive into a little bit to the Moxie example. So when it was first released in 2023, I had my eyes on it. I was like around my midpoint of my PhD. It was commercially available around like $800. Anyone could buy it. It had its own cloud service and etc. It was built for this like social, emotionally supportive robot, mostly for kids, but anyone could use it. And it came in with a quite big of a hype, and it was, demonstrated at CES last year in January. However, fast forward to today, they actually announced bankruptcy back in November. And I was really sad because it's not just that this like very promising platform that has a really big user base failed, but also I don't know if I can set the audio, but in that video on the right, this is a TikTok video from a parent that posted that moment that the mom is announcing that the robot is dead and that he won't be able to interact with it. And it's really heartbreaking. And there's a bunch of families, both their Reddit threads, their TikTok videos, looking into this aspect of how heartbroken kids are that this robot is going away and they can't do anything about it. And that is something definitely that we as roboticists don't want to be happening. Like that is the aspect that we're trying to avoid. And like I said, yes, you might have a good product design, but this like ethical design and focusing on how people will interact with these robots is really important. So that kind of sets the motivation behind my work. I do want to pause for a minute if you have any questions until now. And I also forgot to mention you can interrupt me at any time throughout my talk. We're good? Okay. So in my research, I take a very interdisciplinary approach using qualitative research methods, participatory, exploratory, and holistic approaches. I know these might be a little bit unfamiliar. Are you familiar with like qualitative research, what that might look like versus, more statistical research? Yes, no? Yes, qualitative research. Have anyone heard? Okay. So qualitative research usually looks into the why something happens rather than what is happening. Rather than looking at a frequency, we kind of look at the more broader context of like, why is this certain thing happening? And participatory design is usually where you invite the users that you're designing for in your sessions, and then you design whatever technology together, or you get insights from them. You design it with your team, and then you go back to the users and etc. So that's the context of how I approach my research. And I look at these both the interaction design challenges and the integration challenges. So usually we do these participatory design sessions using insights from interaction design. Then we put these in the real world, and then I tend to, describe the phenomenon that we observe through this human ecology approach, where it's that more holistic, like what is happening in the ecology of the people. I also draw insights from cognitive science and computer science fields as we're both developing and trying to describe this work. So throughout my PhD, I was able to build a research portfolio that spans across these three themes. First, where most of my work is where we look at design, we try to collect design needs of certain users, domain experts. Not all my work is with children and families, but we've worked with cinematographers, we've worked with theater professors, and etc. And that's kind of that top row. And then once we have an understanding of what design needs people have, we then try to put these into the real world, and then we observe what type of use patterns that people have. And at the end of it, what I really enjoy, and it's a little bit challenging, but synthesizing these design needs and use patterns to then give back to the community within the form of like theories and frameworks or guidelines of how we can better design the certain technology, in this case, social robots. So today, in the rest of my talk, I'm gonna point to three work that falls into each category. And in the first work, we did a participatory design session focusing specifically on in-home social robots. We then deployed this robot in family homes for 4 weeks. And at the end, I synthesized all of this work to propose a design framework for family robot interactions. So this first line of work focuses mainly on that interaction design challenges part that I mentioned. What we were really interested about was at the time, so this work was conducted back in 2019, published in 2020, we really didn't know what families would want from a social robot. Like, how would it interact? What would it do? We didn't know anything. So what we did was we invited families, children, and parents to our lab. And we had 6 families with children aged 10 to 12. And we conducted these design sessions where we first separated parents and kids in separate rooms. We interviewed them about what are their daily activities that they do. Nothing related to the robot yet. And then we brought them together. We consolidated the activities that they, especially their children, do at home. They ranked these on these Post-it notes, depending on how frequently they do that. And then at the end, we asked them to select subset of scenarios that they think a robot could fit in, but they haven't met a robot yet at this point. And then we introduced a social robot. This one's called Misty, with a bunch of like supportive design resources, like a wooden dollhouse with furnitures, like a 3D printed miniature and like little Lego figurines. And then basically we asked them to act out and discuss what the robot might be doing within those activities. And that revealed us a lot of insights and a lot of conflicting insights as well, since we had parents and children together. So these findings related to what the robot's role was. Let's just start with that. So here, children mostly saw this robot as a trustworthy companion, that it would talk with the child, play with the child, while the parents actually wanted nothing to do with the robot, except they wanted the robot to do stuff for them. So can it, help me with the chores, and like similar activities like that. So there was like different perspectives towards what the role of this robot might be in the home. And especially when we were asking them about how the robot would interact in group settings, there were a lot of questions like that we couldn't quite find the answers at the time. They were asking stuff like who owns the robot? If the robot enters in a space where there are multiple family members, who will it prioritize? Does the parent own the robot because they pay for it, or does the child own the robot because it's a companion? And there were a lot of like conflicting like priority and authority questions that we and they didn't have an answer at the time. And then this, for me, is one of the most interesting findings from our study. We did hear about privacy concerns, but this privacy was beyond data privacy. So yes, it came up that, would the robot company share my data? But more nuanced findings were that specifically when you put a robot and a social agent within a home with multiple family members, they were curious about the conversational privacy aspect. So if there's a group conversation, let's say you're planning a surprise for their father, if the robot knows this, would it share the secret with the other person? Should it do that? If it should, in what conditions? For example, what would be a sensitive moment that maybe the robot actually should share a secret? Maybe the child is at risk or something like that. So these were, again, very high-level hypothetical points, but I think it's kind of exciting to note about. And yeah, so this first line of work inspired a lot of other research directions as I continued, specifically in the aspect of co-design and different methods, focusing on child-robot interaction. So one work that we did, which was really fun, was looking at that. This is a screenshot from the video you saw early on. We, together with children, we designed this unboxing experience for social robots. And the motivation behind this was like, you know, when you, let's say you buy an Apple phone, it has its own like experience. You read through the manuals. It comes with some amount of battery. It's charged, like you can immediately start using it. But when it comes to social robots, it's like they're, especially the bigger ones, are like in this huge clunky boxes. You don't know, you need to like read through the manuals. And it's like it's so many steps before you actually get to start interacting with it. So we kind of wanted to design something where the robot itself would come, we designed this home together with kids. The robot's box was also designed as its home, but it was also a social, the home was a social robot itself. So when the child would take the robot out of the box, the home would guide the child for their first interaction and then inform them of like what they can do and go through tutorials through verbal instructions. And then the box would say, okay, like I'm now retiring. So you can continue, you know, whatever you want to do, I guess. And more recently, this one is not really about robots, but we conducted a study with children and parents related to their ChatGPT usage. Our logic was that social robots are novel, but at least ChatGPT is something that the families have more experience with, that we can draw insights from. And we were able to identify a lot of like these different parent-child dynamics where some parents were more skeptical, cautious, more hands-on, use it together. Some of them were trusting their child, and some of them were like very independent. So this is very recent, and we're trying to draw insights from these work to as we move forward. Okay, another application, I won't go too much into depth, was that some of the insights we heard from the first study was that children were kind of seeing this robot as a companion, as a homework companion, but we were a little bit skeptical of like the ethical use of that. So we kind of did a study with teachers and students into what type of roles a robot could play in the school and informal learning and homework companionship aspect. And okay, yes. So that wraps up the design work that I have done. The second part of my projects relate to this integration challenge. So another finding we had from that first study was within the companionship roles, children wanted a playmate, a homework companion, and a reading companion. So that kind of aligned with some of our lab's prior work, and we designed this reading companion robot, and we were very curious about how would families actually use this in the real world in their home. So this work was a fully exploratory field study. I refer to this as a long-term in-home child-robot interaction study, and our main goal was to see what type of use patterns were naturally come up within the home. For context, this study was 2022, I believe. So it was right after COVID pandemic, but there was still like no contact regulations and stuff like that. And it was almost a year before the whole like LLM revolutions have been like happening. So that sets a little bit of the context of how we designed this robot. But it was a fully autonomous robot where we put these into 14 families' homes, again, with at least one child aged 10 to 12. And it stayed there for 4 weeks. We interviewed the children and family members once a week, and we collected data from their diary entries. And from the robot's perspective, we collected data related to the interaction logs, like how many times a day the child reads with the robot, how long it is, how many pages they read, etc. And the robot also recorded video only during the reading session. And we would update these every day through a cloud service that we had. For context, the flow of this interaction looked like this. So this reading companion robot, typically the children wanted, when we were designing, they wanted a robot that would read to them. But we wanted to design it in a way that a child would read the book to the robot. And then the robot would simulate this action of listening through nonverbal cues, like making eye contact, making different, there's this term of gaze aversion. So that's what we do naturally as well. So we had very basic capabilities like that integrated on the robot. And then when the child, we augmented every book, every 2 to 3 pages of every book, which we had around 20 books. We augmented them with these AR tags, and the child would show that to the robot once they encountered them. And then in response, the robot would provide a comment that was pre-written by our research team, folks from like education, sciences background. From the robot's point of view, the interaction flow was that the robot would be woken up by the child. The robot would then identify the child and then recommend the books for the day. The robot and the child would negotiate on a reading goal. Then the robot would initiate the reading session, and it would listen as the child is reading. And if it's triggered any comments, it would share expressive comments. And this process repeated either until the reading goal is met or if the child ended the session on their own. Once it ended, the robot would say goodbyes, and then it would ask to be put on the charging pad to go to sleep. And like I mentioned, what our main goal was to identify what type of use patterns that these family members would have with the robot. And it ranged from a variety of, we had most of the children, around 6 of them adopted the robot, which meant that maybe it wasn't every day, but every week, more than 3 times a week, they were interacting with the robot on their own. There were some children that were interrupted throughout the study. Let's say they had family trips, they had visitors coming home. And then after that interruption, it was kind of hard for them to continue using the robot in the same frequency that they did. And then some children modified their interaction, which was interesting for me, where either they stopped reading out loud to the robot, but kept showing the tags, or they just, they avoided any interaction with the robot or read out loud, but skipped using the tags. So they would use the tags as a page holder instead of hearing what the comments of the robots were. And then we had a subset of children that, especially after week 2, I think, discontinued using the robot completely. And there are several reasons that we identified. These aren't like direct correlations. We kind of identified these factors through interviews and what children and parents shared with us. So it ranged from, like, if a parent was more involved, that child was usually more actively engaged. There was a novelty effect of the robot, whether the child was individually interested. The placement of the robot, where it was in the home, so whether it's in a living room or a child's bedroom, that also impacted the type of engagement that was happening, or the distractions. Weekend trips, and then multiple households example is where he had a couple families where like one of them had parents that were divorced and they had two households, so they would need to move the robot to between two homes. And they did that the first couple of weeks, but it was not an easy process for them. So they asked us if they could just keep the robot in one of their parents' home and if it's okay to not take it to the other home. And we're like, that's what you want. That's what you can do. But that was a factor. Or there were some kids that had grandparents that would take care of them. So then again, they would need to go back between homes. And I want to show you a video. It's a little bit chaotic, but this is a video from our video analysis after we looked at a subset of children that adopted the robot and used it regularly. And what we see, our biggest takeaway from the study was that here on this left-hand side, and this is from the robot's camera point of view, what is happening is you might have seen like the cat coming in, they're like siblings in the background, parents in the background, and this child is consistently trying to like set up the robots, go through that reading routine, and the sibling is trying to like touch the robot, and interactions like that were happening. And that again was really exciting to see that even though we haven't designed this robot to engage actively with these other members of the family, just the presence of it had created these novel and engaging engaging moments between family members. And this isn't, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I had a question. So what age groups like interacted more with the robot? Was it, and also what age groups were being tested with the robot?
Yeah. So we call the main user child was between 10 to 12, and we didn't limit any siblings to participate. We actually provided siblings with like guest cards, but we didn't collect data from them. Like even if they're older or younger, it was just like how our study was set up. We only wanted to focus on the 10 to 12-year-old. But yeah, so I think in this family, even though this child had like two siblings, I think both of them were younger than him. I don't think any of them used the guest card or the guest mode, but they just really liked being around the robot. And this video is from like week 3. So it's not even week 1 where it's like new and fancy. It's like this, yeah, happened throughout the deployment. Yeah. Is that helpful? Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, my follow-up was that did you find any like correlation between like age and like and how much they like engage with the robot, where it's like maybe it's like younger children, they might like the novelty of the robot more, find it more company. Maybe
Yeah.
if they're like a lot older, they find it, I don't know, a little bit fake. Who knows?
Yeah, so it's hard for us to make a direct correlation because it was very exploratory and very like we didn't have structured findings where we had a certain number of kids from every age group. But from my observation, we actually did hear some, especially the older kids, would suspend their disbelief of the robot, let's say, would share stuff like, I don't know, there was a comment that it said, the book had something about some break-in and the robot was like, oh yeah, we also had the break-in in my childhood home or something. Younger kids, went through with that comment, but like older kids were like, do you actually have a home? But then they just continued with it. So there were nuances like that. I wish we could do more structured, like comparative study. Just the logistics of doing a study like this is like really difficult.
Okay.
So yeah, we tried to leave it as unstructured as possible. But yeah, it's an open question. Yeah.
Okay, I have like a lot of dots. Like, so I'm trying to like hold back because I know you're trying to explain, throughout this entire process of this, but it almost makes me feel like that people are or like the kids, right? The kids are treating this robot as kind of like a pet,
Yes.
right? And I can't speak for every single kid, right? But then, at least for me, right, I have like two turtles at home, and there are people who come into my house and they like interacting with the turtles, even though they're inside this tank, or sometimes they see them. Where there's this little area where they can kind of like bathe in like
Mhm.
sunlight, quote unquote, but it's like really two lamps, right? And then there's like people like me where I'm not really interacting unless I actually have to. But there's still like a kind of feeling of like, I know they're there, they're kind of sentient. I mean, they are sentient, right? But then I don't know. It's really weird because with this robot, from what you said, like it's pre-programmed, right? You have a book that you read, and then until you get to like, I mean, it looks to me like a QR code, right? And then you see it can autonomously detect what that code is and kind of reply with its own message that's also pre-recorded. And now I'm thinking about like ChatGPT, right?
Oh,
There's like a
yeah.
huge, I don't know, there's like multiple things I'm thinking about because there's more accessibility with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Everyone, I mean, not everyone has a smartphone, but at this point, people have computers, they have a smartphone. It's, more accessible because it's more required out of society for us to have those things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like weird because I feel like we're in a stage of like, unless if you live in somewhere that's like the suburbs, right? Being an SF, I was thinking of the barista like robot at Stonestown, right? And it's like there's some interaction there. There's some like, oh, this is really cool. And you even have like human names for it. And something I know about like human psychology, we often assign things that are inanimate or otherwise like, I mean, our definition of consciousness can really range, right? But we often assign consciousness or sentience towards things that might not necessarily fit our predisposed like ideas of what that is. So I don't know, it's kind of like really interesting to see this kind of happening because there's still a sense of like, I mean, me as an adult, I'd be like, okay, yeah, clearly robot, pre-programmed, whatever. But whenever I talk to ChatGPT, sometimes it's kind of like, oh, I didn't realize that. Or sometimes I feel like maybe it's a little too like catering, but you can also change it in such a way that it's tailored towards your own personal conversations. But yet there's still that like, I don't know, maybe it's like a X factor, for example, the uncanny valley of
Yes.
feeling like it's not really like a conversation I'd have with like one of my friends, for example, or one of my classmates. Because again, there's that tip, like you can tailor it to what you want, but it's maybe it's not something that you like actually need from it. And I don't know, I'm thinking of like other things like Baymax, right? So like
Yeah.
Big Hero 6. It was actually modeled off of a real life robot, like soft robotics, right? And it was something that like my sister, she's a nurse, for example, and she really likes that concept because I think of it in these specialized scenarios where soft robots would actually be beneficial, to elderly people, to people who have mobility issues, disabilities. Well, like for right now, at least it's kind of like, okay, ChatGPT might be here in terms of accessibility and like I'm actually like, interacting with it on maybe a daily basis versus robots where it's like, it's expensive. Like, do I really need it? And I am kind of, I don't know, struggling to figure out like, aside from the industrial standpoint of like robot baristas, robot like companions, like I saw Pepper over there. My high school had a Pepper robot when I was like leaving. I'm struggling to find like very like personalized use cases. It's like for one individual. I think a family case, which you're talking about here, makes a lot of sense because it's a whole like a ton of people, right? And it's like majority of your life is your childhood, right? So it's interesting to see how family dynamics may play a role into it, maybe cultural things too, right? Growing up in a family where like AI might be, looked down upon, or maybe it's like, oh, that's something that's really interesting, but I don't know how much. Like, for example, my parents are going to use something like a robot or even AI. Like they know it exists, they know that it's there. Um, but so far, it seems like we're kind of, I mean, it seems like we're inching like towards it, but I don't really know what the true like inflection point will be in terms of actually implementing that. And then like one last thing before I stop speaking, because I realize I'm saying a lot, but I think of Waymo. At least when that's software I ideally study.
Waymo.
I use Waymo a lot and I actually love it. And sometimes there's moments where I'm like, I even say bye to Waymo, even though I know it can't even like it can't like speak to me necessarily. And I think, you know, being in San Francisco, at least it's like it opens, I don't know, consumers, you know, people who might not otherwise think of using a service like that, and then they incorporate it in other aspects where like using an Uber or Lyft might not be like possible. One example is like one of my friends' mom, they had to take their mom to the hospital and they didn't want to like use an ambulance because an ambulance costs a lot of money, like thousands of dollars, right? So Waymo was way cheaper to get their mom to the hospital. And you know, you don't have to explain anything, you know. Their mom was dealing with a leg injury at the time. And so it was just like, okay, just getting into the car and then driving to the hospital. And it's like, you know, just like that, it's like a successful task. So I'm trying to figure out like, I mean, I don't know what the future holds, but I'm like, I'm still trying to figure out like where social robots will really like, again, have that inflection point.
I mean, I think all the points that you mentioned are conversations we're having within our research field as well. You mentioned stuff like personalization, like adaptation to different members, but like yes, Waymo right now is a very accessible resource here in SF, but in the rest of the country, it's a novel concept. Or if we were to talk like 10 years ago, social robotics research was still pointy. 30 years ago, there was social robotics research ongoing. At CMU, there was a robot receptionist in early 2000s, right? So back then, yes, like it's constantly that same thing. Like we don't really know how and when they're going to be embedded in the real world or whether they will be, but it's likely to happen. Like that's why I gave the context of we didn't have ChatGPT back then, right? Right now, the things that you can do is endless with social engagement. At that time, we needed to have that like simulated social engagement that was also human in the loop approach, where we made sure that the content that the robot says is vetted by people and educators, that it wouldn't cause harm. Versus right now, yes, ChatGPT is very accessible. In that earlier study I mentioned with families, we do see though children have this overtrust on the information that is shared from ChatGPT. So basically my approach, yes, it might feel futuristic, it might feel unrealistic, it might, but it's going to happen sooner or rather than later in this pace of technological innovation. I don't know if it will look like this. But how I look into this is companies are going to keep doing this. They're currently building robots for the home that are like going to be $30,000, $50,000. And there will be people that will buy them. There were people that bought similar robots like 10, 15 years ago, just because they're cool. And what I want to do with my research is that since in case that day happens, like we as researchers need to make sure that we look into like we design these in an ethical and like this human-centered way that hopefully will shape that future. Because if we don't do it, they won't. The companies are not. They don't care about what the people think about it. They care about the money, right? Usually. So we have that privilege in the research domain that we can kind of look into these like edge cases or like what might actually be a useful use case. For example, robots for autism therapy intervention, social robots have been really effective. Or like for older adults, like you mentioned, there are a lot of effective work there. But again, in the day-to-day world, like we don't really know whether we want a single use case robot or a robot that will serve many people. We still don't know. We're figuring it out. And I don't know if it will happen or whether this will be realistic. The big benefit of the reading companion robot, what we heard from children was, yes, they kind of saw it as either a pet or a younger sibling. They mentioned that to us. But a big benefit was often many of these children and their parents, the parents, first of all, don't want a new technology for them to deal with. Like they don't want a new thing to maintain. But for children, especially in the reading case, even though they know it's a robot, even though they know it's programmed, even though they think of it as a pet, one thing that keeps coming up in every study, regardless of whether it's a reading companion or not, is that they keep telling us that the robot feels like it's listening to them. And that's a big novelty there because I mean, in a way, maybe it's kind of sad that children that age don't feel heard by adults. I don't know. It's not a correlation I can make, but we keep hearing that. So there's some benefits that we are trying to figure out. How am I on time?
45, so
What time is it?
we have until 4:45.
Okay. So, okay, I'll wrap up the talk and I really like all the comments and I'm happy to chat about those, but mostly my answer is, so most of these questions, like we don't know yet. But yeah, that's why we need a family-centered approach, I guess. So from the study, the biggest takeaway that we got was, when we're designing these robots for the home, even though it was designed for a dyadic interaction between one child and the robot, we should be able to at least acknowledge or interact with the surrounding family members. It could be for the purpose of like, telling the other family members like, hey, we're doing a learning activity. Maybe like, do you mind like giving us some privacy? Or it could be on the other end where when they see that sibling being engaged, you can be like, hey, do you want to join? And then evolve the reading activity to a multi-sibling activity. So, but these are all kind of more of like the hypothetical directions that we can take. And yeah, like the takeaway that I think this work really inspired me to look forward was we don't know how to study families within the context of robots or in general even technology. It's at least there aren't like robust methods and theories and frameworks that are designed to this technology design and evaluation. Specifically for social robots for families, but also with other technologies, it's limited, I would say. So that shaped my the next thread of my work that actually influenced me to do my PhD minor in human development and family studies. I learned a lot from that field. We conducted some like workshops with the research community to kind of ask about what type of methods that they use. And then yeah, some of the work I did kind of related to, okay, let's brainstorm what type of family related theories can we apply to the robotics field. I'll maybe pass through these a little bit quick. These were some of the work that kind of was inspired by this in-home study. This was conducted by my undergrad research intern. She was interested in designing personally customized robot prototypes for family routines in general. So, that it would be used together, like with parents and children or separately. So imagine like you're getting ready for bed, like the robot prototype helps the child go through the steps of like toothbrushing and maybe helps the parent with like skincare routines, etc. So that was the concept, and we did some similar like family co-design sessions where the designer interviewed families and we made different design choices, like 2 different embodiments, one that looks like a flower and a teddy bear. So just very recently published, and we're just getting into that aspect of like, do we need custom tailored robots or do we need a general purpose robot? I don't have the answer to that yet. And we did some, I'll go through this quick. We did some design sessions with non-children and non-family context with expert designers that ranged from like game designers or digital art designers, etc. To solidify this process of how can we actually design these holistic human-robot interactions scenarios with non-experts So what type of resources can we provide to them? What type of scenarios can we provide to them? So this somewhat relates to the past work, but just wanted to mention it. I'll go through that. Some of the scenarios that came up, again, can't really see too much, but they designed this robot as a guide in an elder care facility that would interact with different children. They designed robots as companions for children in the home that would help them like play, creative activities, robot that would patrol the park. And the idea was that we would design these scenarios and then give them to like robotic developers, and then they would kind of implement these in design scenarios. Okay, so this is the last line of my work that given everything we did, so we looked at the design challenges, we looked at the integration challenges, and then at the end, once we realized, okay, we really need to understand how to design robots for families. And then I mentioned my family studies background, and basically combining both of that, where I proposed a family-centered framework for robot interaction design. And this framework was constructed with the idea of withdrawing theories from the family studies field. Specifically, this family systems theory helped us build this core part of the framework where the theory argues that families are connected systems of individuals, which each of them have their unique roles, needs, and relationships that impact the whole family. So this is pretty straightforward. But then when we think about a social robot being embedded into the home, it won't just be an agent of its own. Even though it has its own roles, goals, and processes, when it's merged, it's going to be in such a way that the robot's role will influence the family's, let's say, roles, goals, and relationships, and vice versa. So this kind of conceptualizes that interconnected systems within the home. And then there's this family ecological model proposed by Bronfenbrenner that describes that in a child's development, there are multiple levels of environmental, I guess, factors, ecological factors that impact the child's development. And these range from micro-level factors that can be their interactions between family members, and going all the way to like macro-level factors, let's say the economy, society, and in the middle, they're like, the neighborhood that they live in or their support system, etc. All of this has an impact on the child's development. So drawing from that, we also put like this contextual system, kind of inferring that whatever in physical environment the human-robot interaction will take place will have an impact to both the family system and the robot system. And then one of the main takeaways from this framework development was I did literature review for for the current work that was out there that looked into some level of family and robot involvement. And there were two ways of looking at this framework when we synthesized this research. It was that either the family's characteristics informed the robot design somehow, in some way, either from the physical design or the way that the robot interacts, etc. Or the robot itself had some impact on the family relationships or family life. And an example that really stuck with me in that thread was this robot, telepresence robot, if you're familiar. It's remotely controllable robots. Let's say you can log on from your phone. The robot doesn't need to be in the same space. And usually that robot has like a camera, you can like control it in a physical space. They gave the tablet to a child in an oncology unit at a hospital that didn't have visitation rights because of their health sensitivity. And then they put the robot into their families' homes with siblings and parents. And the idea was that when, to facilitate connections between the child and their home family members. And it did work for especially early on, it was created excitement. The child from the hospital oncology unit would call in, act like hang out around during dinner time. But then over time, over a couple of weeks later, what happened was that let's say the child in the oncology unit was feeling unwell that day, so they didn't have the energy to call in. But the robot is always at the home. So the siblings were feeling this like, well, first they felt anxious because they thought something bad happened to their sibling back in the hospital. But also just the physical presence of the off-powered robot had an impact onto the siblings, like how they felt in home, even though the child wasn't directly calling in. So those are little nuances that, again, we don't have too much insight on, the both positive and potential negatives of having such robots in the systems. But it's a good example, I think, that presents both like the dichotomy that both can be helpful, but it can create anxiety. I will kind of wrap up here, I think, kind of pointing to some of the other work that all of this work influenced. Kind of mentioned that a lot of this work was funded by the National Science Foundation, and that first paper I presented, we then were able to bring that into broader projects, and one is now we're working on focusing on how can a robot be privacy aware within the home setting, specifically with that conversational privacy aspect, or can it be incorporated with IoT devices to kind of have a more sense of the home and make privacy aware decisions? It's also very early stage. But another big project that we're working on is, again, trying to figure out like what type of routines would a family actually want to be facilitated by a robot? How would that look like? How can we put it in the home? So these are more systematic ways of looking into how a robot can facilitate interactions and well-being and connection and togetherness within the home. Yes, so I will kind of leave it there. I kind of just going to give a more future-facing research agenda, but at a high level, yeah, after I graduate, as I continue with my research, I want to focus again on these two aspects of interaction design and integration. But also there are a lot of applications that we can learn from just this family and home context that goes beyond the family homes. So some things that excite me are like, how can we design, let's say, in more like more creative art, integrate creative arts into having like different robotic arms, or how can we integrate robots into, let's say, manufacturing context, that it's more that we look at the ecology of, let's say, the factory, and who, not just the workers that are interacting with the robot, but how is this decision made? How do organizations integrate a robot into their workplace and aspects like that? I'm going to leave it there and open to questions now. Yes. Thank you. Good to discuss.
First, thank you. I was wondering, what are like the influences, or the things that influence you to pursue this technology?
Can you be a little bit more specific, like what type of my
Just like,
inspirations?
Yeah,
or-
like what kind of inspired you to put it?
Yeah, so our lab, People and Robots Lab, has already been like my advisor has been in this field for a very long time. Starting I think like 2005, I think. So there's that influence through my advisor's lens. But when I started this, so personally, I've always been involved in, if you're familiar with First Lego League tournaments. So in middle school, I was really into, building robots and going to like tournaments and stuff. And I've always been interested in I've kept volunteering in those events, and I've always liked how children, it's a very creative process. So I just had the dream of like, oh, if one day I could combine like work with children and robots. And it was a whole other journey that it aligned very timely way that my advisor had a grant that was just accepted that focused on that. So both personal interests and the resources. Without the resources, it's really hard to do any work like this. So I guess that's my core motivation. But the children that I interact with as part of my studies, they really inspire the ongoing decisions. Like, yeah, they're brilliant. So yeah, that's I think are my inspiration.
What level of complexity do you think the technology is ready for? Because obviously, a consumer would want the robot that's capable of doing everything, but it's not infinite money to do that.
Yeah.
Where is the sweet spot right now?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, I used to say that the soft no, oh, what's the other way around? So there's a hardware and the software. So a couple years back, hardware products were available that had the potential in some way, but software wasn't there yet. And let's say in the robot that we had with Misty, we wanted to have facial recognition and detection on the fly. But when we had it, it was lagging everything else. So we decided to take it out just because of the processing power. So there's like this constantly this like either hardware is there and then software is lagging, or right now, like software, especially like LLMs, so social interactive software is ahead, but now the hardware is lagging. So what level of complexity? I personally argue that the less complex the robot is, the more useful it will be. You can think of Roombas, like they only have one job. They do that job kind of okay, well, but they work and people like it and they keep buying it and they're like incremental changes. So if we can start there instead of what right now most of the companies are building these like super humanoid like robots with these big promises of like they're gonna do your dishes, they're gonna bring you coffee, they're gonna do that. Like I don't think that's the right way to go. We need to start simple, maybe even just like Raspberry Pi powered like 3D printed robots could be the way to start to set the expectations low or moderate, and instead of starting here and trying to meet them there. So that's my opinion. People might have different thoughts though.
You say the social robot for the family, but it seems like most of the experiments were revolved around the children.
Yes.
Is that a particular reason? Because children will be the next generation?
So when I started my PhD work, there wasn't even the concept of robots for family settings. So we kind of just like child robot interaction was a thing. So we were following that and doing incremental changes there. And then after that in-home study, the big takeaway was like, okay, we can't, when you put a product into the home, even if you design it only for the child, there's no way that that will stay there. Like everyone will be involved in some way or form. So I'm kind of trying to push the field in that direction. So I try to convince people that we need to look at families and not just the children, or we also call it the care ecosystem sometimes. So it's not, even if the product is designed for a child, there are, let's say, therapists, teachers, friends, parents, will all have an influence in how they interact with the robot. So yes, I call it this family robot interaction, but there really isn't any examples that I know of that do like really do interactions between like family members in our domain. So yeah, I want to get there, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, just kind of add on to that. So I'm very interested to see if what the psychological effects of doing this, especially like, because for what I'm seeing, it's like a reading partner for these children, right? What the psychological effects of that are long term when like right? Maybe parents aren't able to read to their children and how that affects their social behaviors as well over time. I'm not sure if there's been a study concluded on that, but like it'd be very interesting to know if, or to see if you have any idea of how that might affect them.
Longitudinal studies are very limited. I wish as well that we as researchers, we try to be, well, we have like ethical review boards, like we talk with, so a lot of my collaborators are now I work with like family scientists and try to build these technologies with more, I guess, with the well-being in mind, but we don't know the long-term effects. I wish there were more studies that we could know whether this will impact them, support them, but we have anecdotal evidences. So our main goal is not to like replace different family members, what they currently do, but we want to, let's say households where, like you said, the parents might not have either the literacy or the resources to support their child's like reading habits. And this could be, maybe in that case, they might not be able to afford the robot as well, but maybe there could be community center resources that you can like lend a robot or go to a library and like participate in these programs is a supplement rather than a replacement to their current resources, but there really isn't much. People use robots for like teaching programming for kids, but I think this is a different aspect that we're trying to do.
Thank you.
I think we are at 4:45 now, so if you have any additional questions or discussions, so we can bring them up after, but otherwise you're free to go. If you're in my class, make sure you turn in your attendance credit. But otherwise, have a good rest of your evening.